Parenti is an old man. Parenti's an old man.
He uses the word skullduggery.
Skullduggery. Well, there's a chapter where he's talking about the plight of the youth, and he can't stop saying youngsters. Yeah. Or, my God. Hey, how are you?
Hello.
Welcome to Left Unread.
My name is Aaron.
I'm Will.
We are two dudes engaged in a radical self-education.
We're simply two vagabonds who'd rather risk the gallows than work for a wage.
Nice. This episode, we have read Democracy for the Few by the great Michael Parenti.
We've read Black Shirts and Reds on the show before. I have read a few other Parenti books. Not all of them were absolute bangers, but today we've come together to read Democracy for the Few. It's probably one of his most lauded books, and this one was a little bit of an experience because I actually have the 8th edition, and Aaron got the 9th edition.
Yeah, so we'll see the difference. I'm going to guess that primarily the difference is a whole lot of Obama apologia, but yeah, I marked anything that was very evidently from 2009 or 2010, which is the last year that I saw any data mentioned. So we can take a look at how it changed. I also have an edition from 1980 that I read the introduction for, and it's like, now that Reagan is president, we'll see. And I was like, oh, brother.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it'll be an interesting one. This was an interesting choice. I'm not sure that we're the intended audience for this book.
No, it's interesting that this is a textbook because I don't know what class is assigning this, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I would have liked that class in 2009 when I was in college. I would have probably eaten this book up. And I think it is very much of that time, being a person that was doing a lot of lib-left political reading at the time. This definitely reads very much like that same sort of stuff. Honestly, my largest criticism of the book is that it just reads like a Michael Moore book.
Yeah. I'm hesitant to say it, but it kind of feels left slop. This is left slop. Maybe a too modern a term to describe this book from 2008 or 2010. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. You know, I really love Michael Parenti. Parenti's the GOAT, but man, there were some times reading this where I felt like I was on my Facebook feed or something. And yeah, I don't know. One of the categories of notes I have is just blunders of Parenti. You know, he makes a few in here, some of which I can overlook, some of which I can't so much. So I don't know if we'll see any of them during our conversation here. But
yeah, I'm curious to hear how that plays out. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think globally about this book, my feelings are just kind of like meh, shoulder shrug. Like, he does present some information in a reasonably compelling way. I feel like if you are a left-leaning liberal, this probably speaks to you a lot. And it might be a good catalyst to kind of push you further left into further left reading. I don't think that this is a good representation of the state of leftism in 2009 necessarily, or 2010, whenever this edition was published, somewhere around there, because it definitely reads more lib-pilled than that. You know what I mean? And especially in the context, the Chomsky-Parenti debate. I was reading Chomsky at the time, unfortunately. And, I mean, Chomsky's analysis was certainly more left-leaning than the analysis in this text. Now, obviously, history has shown us who is the one we should be really following, but...
Yeah, well, right. Like, it's very boomer Facebook coded. I don't know. A lot of it feels like a tirade. Like you said, I don't know who the audience for this is, you know? Maybe the aughts were just a different time. I mean, I was technically alive, so...
I mean, I was an adult and active politically at this time, and it feels kind of milquetoast even to my memory of that.
Yeah, it's very odd too, because I don't know, like, maybe it's crazy to say that Michael Parenti was tempering himself here because he says some insane shit in this book. I mean, he really goes on a conspiratorial grind for a couple of things.
The fluoride is making the frogs gay.
Oh my God, there's not to get so far ahead of myself, but good God. Just want to take a look at page 79 for me, because he says completely unabashedly, the military already can beam powerful electromagnetic or pulsed radio frequency radiation transmissions back to Earth, seriously impairing the mental capacity of whole populations, causing severe physiological disruption or perceptual disorientation for an extended period, according to the Air Force. I do have some gripes with Parenti's sourcing in this book. I don't know if I want to expand on that right this second, but just to look at the source for that, It comes from the classic, the Pulitzer-winning Earth Island Journal, Really nice. He's actually referencing HARP with 2 A's, which if you don't know is it's like a weather research base up in Alaska, which is a big target for a lot of conspiracy theories about how we make fucking hurricanes to go hit China. And we control the ionosphere with our ultramagnetic radiation. Not to say there isn't anything crazy happening there, but I don't know if an Air Force official really exclaimed that we could seriously impair the mental capacity of whole populations.
Yeah.
And am I willing to go and dig up that Earth Island Journal article and try to find it? No, to be frank, I'm not. And that's something I've done a lot with Parenti, because this book goes in so many different directions, so many different ways. I think it really does make a nice jumping off point. That's one thing I'll say about Parenti as a whole, is that any of his books leave a lot of questions for you to then explore, right? I think there's a lot of opportunity in this book and in Black Shirts and Reds to go off and take a look at other stuff. And a couple of examples are mentioned in both books. Like, he does talk about, very briefly, he mentions like the fact that the US invaded the Soviet Union after 1917 or 1918. And so, like, there's a lot of stuff that's worth jumping off at. But if you have to do your own research, basically, because a lot of his sources are like, one article from 1996 in the New York Times or something like that.
Yeah, it's not an academically sourced text for sure. It definitely reads like more like a pop history kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so take that as you will, which again just begs the question, comes back to that question, like, who is the intended audience for this? Because anyone in higher academia, I think, would look at this as not being sufficient, and that is the intention, right? That it's a textbook.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a little strange, but I do agree that I think it's a good maybe springboard source or an interesting foot in the door of investigating some of these questions further. Side note, I don't think the quote that you read is in my edition.
Really?
So.
Yeah. Maybe somebody discredited.
Cooler heads prevailed.
Yeah. Well, it's not the only one. I mean, I don't want to bash Parenti too much. Rest in peace, the guy.
Yeah.
But I don't know how many times he talks about Yugoslavia in your book, but he really does a lot of apologia there for straight up genocide, for 100% ethnic cleansing. And buddy, I've just simply read enough sources to know better, because wowie, wow. He talks about mass graves that just don't show up after the war ends, Come on. That's really all I really need to say about that topic there.
Yeah.
I've expressed my feelings about Parenti on Yugoslavia before, and the point he makes about the fact that we did 80 straight days of fucking bombing and blew their country to bits, regardless of the war that was going on there, is worth its own discussion, I think. Outside of whatever the fuck else Michael Parenti believes about Yugoslavia.
Yeah.
I mean, like I said, I was a child in the 2000s, so I didn't get to see all of this live and uncut as you might have. But the 2000s were kind of an insane era. The Bushes seem like an insane... I mean, you lived through 2000 and 2004. You were voting, right? Both of those elections ostensibly are stolen. So how does that make you feel, Aaron?
Not good. And I mean, he mentions in my edition, I don't know if he mentions it in yours, the Ohio election in 2006, which is also a pretty famous example of election rigging and gerrymandering. Ohio is a terribly gerrymandered state, and there was a big election scandal in 2006 for election rigging. Nothing happened afterward. The people that stole it kept their seats and everything went on just like fine. So that was a big, like, that as a topic was kind of undergirding all political discourse at the time,
Yeah.
That and the war in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
God, maybe that's not a bad place to start, because such a large part of this book is just about the discrepancy that's in our democracy. There's so much inequity that's just present in our system. Like, even thinking about all the cases where no one goes to jail, there's an entire incredible section where he just goes again and again and again. He's just like, and yet nobody went to jail. All right, this is actually chapter 10, Unequal Before the Law, the subsection Crime in the Suites.
Oh, that's chapter 9 for me.
I just love this because he has so many different examples. He talks about all the different companies whose factories were used by the Nazis during World War II, right? He talks about how they sought compensation from the government for that. Nobody went to jail in that case, right? He says, over a 16-year period, major oil firms cheated the government of nearly $856 million in royalties. In none of these instances did anyone go to jail. There's so many insane examples in American history that are just it's just so on its face how fucked this system is. It's too many examples. Like even this book, it feels just like again and again and again. So many different statistics, so many different case studies. You know, it's always that question of like, why did the people put up with this? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I guess that's kind of the question that surrounds this book, and he never really addresses it. He's saying like the system is so fucked up. Everything that has been good produced by this system has been a consequence of people struggling against it, not necessarily people struggling for it. And even in the modern era, you can see all of these different examples where all of these people, absolutely ridiculous, charged with unlawfully burning toxic waste into the atmosphere for 20 years, the Potomac Electric Power Co. of Washington, D.C. was fined a crushing sum of $500. In none of these cases does anyone go to prison. $38 million in penalties for money laundering, but no one goes to jail. Halliburton required to pay $9 million in undisclosed tax penalty, but nobody goes to jail for grand larceny. You know, and then he has 100 different examples of people going to jail for, you know, life sentences for first-time possession of cocaine, right? 55 years for stealing $100 worth of videos, while Winona Ryder gets a slap on the wrist for stealing thousands of dollars worth of merchandise.
Yeah.
It's just this insane discrepancy in the system. It's insane that we even put up with it. I don't even know. Like, that's the problem that I have with this book, is that it's just so like, here it is, America sucks.
Yeah. I think that that's a fair assessment. That's a good encapsulation of my feelings about it. Like you said, he'll present a point, and then he goes through a litany of examples that demonstrate that point. Like, you only named like 3 of the corporate crime examples, but it's pages of him just paragraph after paragraph showing you different examples. And it's like, yeah, that fucking sucks. The commentary is, yep, I mean, like that.
You know, and the thing is that I hate to be a communications guy. Like, I hate to be a messaging guy. But again, who's this for? You know, like, it's too derisive for people that are firmly entrenched to read and be like, ugh, I'm now disillusioned with America. You know, it's only people that are already suffering from it. Like, I just don't know who this changes the opinions of. You know, I hate to be so critical of this book.
You know, that's funny, because I have the same perspective, but a different conclusion. Okay. And I do think that you're right to say it's crazy to say that Parenti tempered his position here, because he does say some pretty wild shit. But I think largely his approach to it is much more magnanimous and conciliatory. Yeah. And just kind of like, here is the situation. And it's still always presented. Actually, I'll read a quote. This is at the very end of chapter 1. Okay. It's literally the last paragraph to chapter 1 for me. But he presents a very magnanimous and conciliatory attitude that's still very pro-America, pro-United States, pro-Constitution at least, right? I think he frames it as a pro-democracy attitude. Yeah. But he says, if the picture that emerges in the pages ahead is not pretty, this should not be taken as an attack on the United States. For this country and its people are greater than the abuses perpetrated upon them by those who live for power and profit. To expose these abuses is not to denigrate the nation that is a victim of them. And number one, my comment was, I was saying boo earns.
Smithies, are they booing me?
No, they're saying boo earns. Boo earns.
Are you saying boo or boo earns?
I was saying boo earns.
My attitude is very much farther left than that. Yeah, it is fuck America, because fuck America. But I think like that's a good representation of how I was perceiving him to temper his rhetoric. Sure. In a way that maybe lulls people that are already left leaning into going along with and listening to his argument. My question that I've been sitting with while reading it is that even a useful endeavor? Yeah. I think that opens the door to a lot of reformism and reactionary elements coming into the movement. I think you have to be very clear about your position as a, let's say, the party. You have to be very clear about your position and attitude as the party. And to temper your rhetoric is already a way of allowing yourself to lose that. But there is part of me that's like my lib aunt, who's like a white feminist. She would probably read this book, and it might do something to open the door to a larger conversation with her, that when she sees my God Forgives I Don't Karl Marx t-shirt, she gets a little standoffish. You know what I mean?
I'm thinking it's two things, really. Because, I do agree with you, but all the people like that in my life would hate this book.
Really?
You know? Yeah. I don't know. It's just something about it's smug. Anyway, that's not the point there. I think there is something interesting there about the American ideal, because that's ultimately what we're talking about. Is there an American ideal worth saving? And I think that's so tough. You know, Parenti's definition of democracy is different. I mean, it's not different than something that we might want, but he talks about, the fact that democracy shouldn't just be a system of rules, right? It should be something that provides the best thing for the people. And I think that that's such an interesting definition of democracy because it's one that's so abstracted from how we view American democracy. That's kind of the weird question. If, almost like you said, reform, if we're able to reclaim American identity in such an extent, I don't know if it's going to be found in American democracy, say. You know what I mean? I certainly don't think it'll be found in the American system as it has ever stood in history. I mean, I already think that there's so many ways that our system, even in its procedural rules, is totally biased. I mean, he talks plenty about how the founding fathers set it up specifically. They wrote the Constitution to quell popular unrest. They specifically wanted a strong center so they could deal with the kinds of rebellious attitudes that they saw present. I mean, he quotes George Washington in 1787 saying that in every state there's the chance of rebellion, such as we saw 10 years before. That's why we need a constitution. And it's really that question of, like, at its very founding, how democratic was America meant to be? This kind of gives credit to Parenti's even-handedness because he does talk about things that the founders did that, were for the masses, essentially. But so much of it has to do with the preservation of their wealth, the preservation of their class, and the preservation of class rule. So when we're talking about the American ideal, where is that? It's not in the founding, it's in the people. I mean, sure, but I don't know. Like when we're looking at the firm documents of America that people talk about when they talk about the history of American democracy, the Federalist Papers, the Constitution, all of that shit. What we're looking at is bourgeois society. What we're looking at is class rule. If we're reclaiming the American identity, how much of that shit are we really taking with us?
I agree with you. I think that's a fair question. My interpretation of his approach in this book is to discuss all of the ways that the reality of democracy in America falls short of the ideal of democracy in America and trying to bridge that gap to some degree. So I agree that it's a flawed premise, but I do think it's an interesting approach. Again, if the audience is intended to be people that are already...
pro-American.
Yeah, that might be a way to get them a little more open to the scary socialist ideas that he presents at times, And I think he does a pretty good job of exposing exactly how undemocratic the American system truly is.
Yeah.
So I think, like, at the very least, it's a pretty good treatise on that to show you, like, you think you live in a democracy, but here's all the reasons you don't.
Yeah.
You already mentioned the crime stuff. To that end, I'll point out one thing. This is in chapter 2 in the fragmenting majority power section. It's a reframing that I hadn't really thought of, which makes me feel stupid, but Parenti writes, in keeping with their desire to contain the propertyless majority, the founders inserted what Madison called auxiliary precautions designed to fragment power without democratizing it. They separated the executive, legislative, and judicial functions and then provided a system of checks and balances between the three branches, including staggered elections, executive veto, the possibility of overturning the veto with 2/3 majority in both houses, Senate confirmation appointments, ratification of treaties in a bicameral legislature. That's the sort of shit that everybody gets fed in 10th grade American history that you probably at that time knew was bullshit. But they contrived an elaborate and difficult process for amending the Constitution requiring proposal by 2/3 of both the Senate and the House and ratification by 3/4 of the state legislatures. To the extent that it existed at all, the majoritarian principle was tightly locked into a system of minority vetoes, making swift and sweeping popular action less likely. So the majority principle that we're sold, the idea that the democracy in the United States is a majority rule, is not actually true because the majority principle is usurped by the minority veto. Mm-hmm. And again, that's baked into the system as a way of quelling unrest from wealthy elites that wrote the Constitution because they recognized their class interests at the time. I would like him to take his rhetoric farther and point that out, but like pointing things like that out, I think is effective in getting people to examine more closely the propaganda that they've been fed about what America actually is versus the reality of how it actually plays out.
There's something I'm trying to deal with right now, and it's the fact that we know about all of this stuff already. Like gerrymandering is taught in school. We learn about all the ways that our society is fucked already. I mean, I don't want to say that it's like...
I think that's a very 2026 perspective. I have to be honest. When I was in school, that shit wasn't a part of the curriculum.
No, I think that's totally fair, but I don't know. It's still so present. I mean, damn, man. I was in school in the 2010s, you know, and I was learning about all sorts of shit. I mean, I was in I'm trying to think of the demographics of my school district, you know. We were probably Democrats, if I had to guess, but I don't know, man. It feels almost the same way that, like, academia could be presented as a place for these radical ideas to be contained. You know, it's like so much of this stuff they just speak clearly about. You know, we know about it already, and it's almost like they know that the system is so labyrinthian that it's hard to change. Like they're almost not even worried about saying it, you know? I don't know. I'm trying to think of other examples besides gerrymandering, but I don't know. An incomplete thought there. Yeah, I do have too narrow a view, I think, to really complete this thought, because like I learned about the Black Panthers in school and all sorts of shit like that. I didn't learn they were Marxists or anything like that, but as a force for civil rights, they were taught to me. Weird sentence, but hey, you know, we also learned how they were destroyed.
Really?
Yeah.
You and I had vastly different high school experiences.
That's fair.
Man. I don't know. I'm still on it. I mean, there are events in history that were previously completely erased that then transitioned into being maybe whitewashed and now are being taught more appropriately toward the real history of the event.
Yes.
Like Tulsa is a good example of that. That wasn't mentioned when I was in school. Then a version of it that was like softened, you know, might have come out. And then in the last even 5 years, I think 5 or 6 years, that has come more to the fore, where that event and other events like it are taught more true to the actual history. But like, to what end? Your point is like, what does that do? We know that happened. Why aren't we reacting?
It's almost like what we were talking about on the last episode, where it's like the process has been completed. Whatever happened in the past is so far removed that they can talk about it flagrantly. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And I feel like some of these things almost fit the same vein. You know, like I think Tulsa's a pretty good example. It's an interesting one because a lot of people will say it's because it was portrayed in the Watchmen show. Mm-hmm. Like that's driven by culture in that case. And
Vietnam is another example. We know how fucking atrocious we were in Vietnam and Korea.
Well, we're far enough away from it where it doesn't matter to talk about it.
That's what I'm saying, like, to your point. Like,
yeah, no, you're totally right. I mean, even Iraq to an extent. People have already fucking rehabilitated George W. Bush. You know, I'd love to have a beer with that guy.
Yeah.
You know, he paints.
Jesus Christ.
Like, well, I mean, you know, shit, man. They did the same stuff with John McCain right when he died.
Who's that fucking guy? The podcaster guy? Adam something? Because he had one of the Cuomo brothers on a show, and he was like, when I was a kid, it was cool to fucking hate George Bush.
The Adam Friedland podcast, yeah.
Yeah, guy was like, why would you waste your energy on that? And he's like, because he killed 1 million people.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I mean, that's the crazy stuff, too, especially thinking about George W. Bush, man, to read so much of the stuff. Like, no wonder there was so much hope with Obama. People are so willing to just say, like, Obama was the greatest shit ever because George W. Bush was, like, demonically evil, you know? And that's, like, so 2006 internet left-coded, but it's ridiculous how evil and Republican he is. I mean, it's insane. And I know that's crazy to say when we live under Trump, the Trump regime today, but my God, like just the ways that they were completely subverting our democracy right in front of everyone's eyes. They didn't give a fuck and a half.
You know, maybe I'm not speaking of it with a complete view because my political awakening was concurrent with George W. Bush's first term. You know what I mean? Like, so I can't really say I was all that aware of what the discussion around the Clinton presidency was, or H.W. Bush, or anything like that, because I was too young and I wasn't really tapped in the same way. But the feeling at the time, what I remember of the feeling of George W. Bush was that it was just plain-faced evil.
Yeah.
That it was new in that regard. Mm-hmm. And again, that feels absurd to say today.
You know, it's even funny, though, too, to say that after Reagan, you know, like...
Yeah.
I feel like Reagan is also plain-facedly evil in so many of his actions. And I know that that's easy for us to say from this viewpoint. Like, I'm reading Reagan Land right now, and there's so many people that are just like, I can't even imagine that these people exist. The way that they go through their day-to-day and view the world and view everybody that lives around them in such this insane, like, religious, evangelical, conservative viewpoints, all of those, they're just insane, you know? So it's even crazy to say that, like, Bush was some new kind of evil after people lived through Reagan.
Yeah.
You know? I don't know. Total side note, but shout outs Rick Perlstein. Highly recommend. I haven't read the Barry Goldwater book, but Nixon Land Invisible Bridge, Reagan Land. I know I've said it a lot in the last couple of episodes, but they're fucking fantastic because that was truly the beginning of the end. I mean, right before we started recording, we joked that it was like we're still living in like the long 2000s. People say like the long 2016. It's like, fuck it, man. We're still living under the Bush regime, essentially, the extension of that. And then I was like, well, what about Reagan too?
Yeah.
It's just an insane...
I don't know. I mean, I guess you can always just play that game, though, because then when you say, what about Reagan, I think, what about Nixon?
Sure.
You know?
Yeah, I mean, that's totally fair, but I don't know. There's something about, you know what? It kind of feels like it's like a qualitative shift, right? There's something that Parenti says in here that the way we've been able to keep our prosperity growing is that we've just been on a permanent war economy after World War II, you know? And there's like a total consequence of that we're obviously reckoning with today. And it's the fact that it's fucking fascistic, you know? Like, there's a great bit in here where he says, like, why doesn't the ruling class just resort to fascism? He says, yeah, it lasts for a little bit, and then you start to lose your credibility and that kind of stuff. And it's like, wow, totally prescient, I guess.
Yeah.
Because we're kind of seeing it now. But how much of that is the extent of the fact that we've stretched this war economy to the absolute limit? You know, it's that same kind of reproduction crisis I was talking about in the last episode.
Mm-hmm. To that, I'll just agree with George Jackson that we've been a fascist state since our inception, and it's just becoming more and more apparent as time goes on.
Yeah.
Some random tidbits of information that he throws out that I think maybe you want to talk to your lib uncle about or whatever. Very early on in chapter 2 for me, in the section Class Power in Early America, Parenti is laying the groundwork for how class division has been baked in from the get, and he uses this piece of information that I thought was really interesting. By 1700, 3/4 of the acreage in New York belonged to fewer than a dozen persons. In the interior of Virginia, 7 individuals owned over 1.7 million acres. And he goes on, but like those are just perfect examples of the class division that has been here from the onset. The idea that anyone has ever been given a fair shake in the United States is laughable.
Yeah, there's a couple books that I'm really interested in reading that are around this kind of thing. The Counter-Revolution of 1776 by Gerald Horne, and the one I've talked about before, sometimes as an April Fool's joke, is Settlers by Jay Sakai, The Myth of the White Proletariat. You know, and it's statistics like these that make me interested in that kind of stuff. I mean, even on the next page, South Carolina state senators had to possess estates worth at least 7,000 pounds clear of debt, equivalent to over $1 million today.
Yeah.
You know, we're still dealing with millionaires. It's just in a different sense. I mean, God, don't forget that they were slave owners. I mean, that's really the point here.
Yeah.
James Madison says he makes $200 and something off of each slave, for which he spends $12 or $13 upkeep.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's just raw fucking exploitation.
Yeah.
Something that Parenti says here in this chapter that I really like, and it's the fact that it's not to say that they didn't have visions of state building. You know, it's just that their entire conception of nationhood was aligned with their class interests. Their entire conception of a better, more organized state, something that would be better overall, the America that they're envisioning that we talk about when we talk about the Father's vision, the Founding Fathers' vision, the Founding Fathers' visions.
The Father's vision.
Yeah, the Founding Fathers' vision is one that is essentially the dream of a bourgeois state. It's of bourgeois rule. Again, it's so tough to get back to that because when we're talking about American identity and like the American ideal, it's everything that's not that.
Yeah, he says this is all the way in the last chapter, but he does say, in reality, power is structured through entrenched, well-organized, well-financed politico-economic channels. Wealth is the most crucial power resource. It creates a pervasive political advantage and affords ready access to most other resources. Apologists for the existing system make much of the fact that wealthy interests do not always operate with clear and deliberate purpose. But if they are not omniscient and infallible, neither are they in a state of chronic confusion. If they do not always calculate correctly in the pursuit of their class interests, they do so often and successfully enough, and they are keenly aware that they do have class interests.
Yeah, I'm looking for because there's times where Parenti could sound conspiratorial. There's even a part where he says, like, there's no, like, cabal, essentially, but it's just the fact that they're all acting in their own self-interest, which is capitalistic interest, you know? Like, it doesn't have to be some secretive, shady power structures. Not to say that those things don't exist, my God, but it's just the fact that the society can only breed one type of capitalist, you know, and that's one that is ruthless and exploitation and profit driven. It's almost to say like they don't have a choice, you know, which they don't. I mean, I don't know.
It's interesting. I was thinking a lot about the profit motive while reading this, and I have a couple of pages that I want to call to, but...
Well, there's an interesting quote on 30 for me. This is in chapter 3, the plutocratic culture, institutions, and ideologies, in the section corporate plutocracy and ideological orthodoxy, where he says, although we are often admonished to think for ourselves, we might wonder if our socialization process allows us to do so. Ideological orthodoxy so permeates the plutocratic culture that it is often not felt as indoctrination. The worst forms of tyranny are those so deeply ingrained, so thoroughly controlling, as not to even be consciously experienced as constraints. People are expected to operate individually, but towards rather similar goals. Everyone competes against everyone else for the same thing. Individualism in this corporate-dominated culture refers to acquisitiveness and careerism. We are expected to get what we can for ourselves and not to be too troubled by the problems faced by others. Whether or not this individualism allows one to have control over one's own life is another story. The decisions about the quality of food we eat, the goods we buy, the air we breathe, the prices we pay, the wages we earn, the way work tasks are divided, the modes of transportation available to us, and the images we are fed by media are usually made by people other than ourselves.
Yeah, that's why I get so fucking pissed when people say, like, I'm not political. I'm an apolitical person. And it's like, bitch, yes, you are. There's no escaping it. Yeah. Political decisions are being made for you. You can either participate in those decisions, resist those decisions, or whatever. But, like, your inaction is, in and of itself, a political decision. And he even says that government isn't neutral. It is always going to be working in the interests of one person. This is very early on in the book. Mm-hmm. The shaping of a budget, the passage of a law, and the development of an administrative program are all policy decisions, all political decisions, and there is no way to execute them with neutral effect. Like government isn't neutral, it can't be neutral. Decisions are being made for you all the time that impact the material reality of your life. There's no way around it.
Yeah. We talk so much about the purpose of the state, but like the state as it has been established throughout history has already been described by people like Adam Smith. And like I love in the beginning of chapter 4, A Constitution for the Few, he says, the people who created the Constitution, the people who gathered in Philadelphia in 1787, strove to erect a strong central government. They agreed with Adam Smith that government was, quote, instituted for the defense of the rich against the poor, and, quote, grows up with the acquisition of valuable property.
A lot of the stuff that he is talking about here is really the natural consequence of everything being dictated by the profit motive. And the first quote I would point to is at the very end of chapter 8, The Last Environment. Because this whole chapter, he's gone through examples of how capitalism is destroying our environment. And ultimately, what he called global warming or climate change is an imminent threat that needs to be taken care of. And all of these attitudes of putting the corporate interests above the interests of our environment is obviously devastating for all life on the planet. And he closes the chapter by writing, of utmost importance are the serious contradictions that exist between our well-being and the profit-driven corporate system. Big business's modus operandi is to produce and sell at an ever-expanding rate, treating the world's resources as limitlessly expendable. But the earth is finite, as is its water supply, oxygen, topsoil, and ability to absorb toxins and heat from energy consumption. An infinitely expanding capitalism and a fragile, finite ecology are on a calamitous collision course. Our very survival hangs in the balance. First, shout out to him for talking about this in 2010 with appropriate alarmism.
Yeah.
But when I read that, the note that I wrote to myself was just that there is no such thing as a reformable, sustainable system that still includes the profit motive. Only when we destroy and rebuild with ecological sustainability and wellness in mind can systems function to serve us. And any kind of reformative practice that looks to simply limit capitalist expansion or imperialist expansion, whatever, is always going to fall short of being something that actually serves us ecologically. And there's another line that really jumped out to me with regards to this in how globalism undermines democracy.
Yes.
Because he's talking about the distinction between free trade and fair trade. He goes on quite a tirade against NAFTA and the GATT. And first of all, there's an irony there. He's talking about companies moving to Mexico after NAFTA and CAFTA. He says these firms are so heavily subsidized by the U.S. government that they easily undersold Mexican farmers. It's a fun irony of the quote-unquote free market. But the bit that stood out to me, he says, free trade is not fair trade. It benefits the rich interests in all nations at the expense of the rest of us, circumventing what little democratic sovereignty we have been able to achieve. My question is revolving around the profit motive. Why is an international market even necessary? If you eliminate the profit motive, the only global incentive is safety for encirclement. If there is no profit motive, right? And presuming that there's not some rare thing that, I mean, I love coffee, right? That's not being grown in the United States. But like, there's no need for a global market, so to speak. So there's no need for this infinitely expansive machine that ultimately is built on imperialism, driven by the profit motive. You know what I mean? If you can eliminate the profit motive, there's no am I missing a reason why you would need any sort of global market? We make enough food in the United States to feed more than everyone in the United States. We have all of the other stuff that we need to maintain infrastructure. There's no need for a global market. That's my point. That's a dumb point.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting to think about. So much of globalization is always put forth as a positive thing because it's built on us receiving cheap goods. It's about us getting our treats, essentially. It's funny because it's that same kind of thing. Like, even when I was studying economics, they talked about how horrible globalization actually has been for things. You know, the race to the bottom, horrible working conditions. I mean, global fucking slave labor, essentially. And it's just baked in there like it's another consequence of, it's just like an unavoidable consequence of global capitalism. To speak to your point, I don't know, it's so interesting to think about because we don't need a global market for these kinds of things. It's easy to say as an American, I will say, because we have so much shit.
That's true. If you are in an overexploited country, that's a harder position to take.
Yeah.
But if the exploiters moved out, if the colonizers move out or are made to retreat, and there is no fear of encirclement. Like, I recognize that as being as a primary incentive for maintaining some sort of global market.
Yeah.
But in this theoretical position, we push out the colonizers, then you are left. Those colonizers are there because you have resources of value. And if they are no longer there, you now have the opportunity to use the wealth of your nation for the betterment of your nation, not for it to be plundered, pilfered, and taken to give us our treats while everyone else is subsisting on a slave wage, you know what I mean? But that's maybe a little too reductive. I'll recognize that. But like, I guess why I was thinking about this in the context of him talking about free trade is because in my house growing up in the 90s, the discussion around NAFTA, I grew up here in Ohio in the Rust Belt where it was possible in the 80s to have a one-income home where one adult was working, another adult did not have to work, could stay and raise children, and you could make a good living wage working for GM.
Yeah.
One of the different companies that, contracted with GM or with GM directly. There were good manufacturing jobs in our area. And when NAFTA came in, all of those jobs left because they all got exported mostly to Mexico. That's not Mexico's fault, but like the discussion in my house growing up was always like it was a betrayal of, America, so to speak, to sign agreements like this, to take jobs away from folks that were working them and making a living and feeding the system that was so prosperous for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. I'm thinking like if there was no incentive to lower costs by moving plants where there were fewer environmental regulations, there were fewer labor regulations, so they could pay cheaper labor. They had fewer restrictions on how that labor was operating and how their plants were operating, polluting the water and ground around them and the air. The deal is that we get maybe a cheaper car by exploiting other folks, but we don't have a job to buy that car anymore. Like, it's just a fucking raw deal.
Well, it's so funny because, like, it's easy for us to see, but, like, we're talking about the things that lead to these crises of overconsumption. The same things that Marx was talking about, the same things that Parenti talks about, the same things that, in my edition, he even foreshadows leading up to 2008 into the recession. But it's part of that, right? Like, the goods were cheaper and more available on the market. But, the consequence of that is that the laborers they have a lowered wage.
Yeah.
He talks again and again about how the real wages of laborers keep falling. People always say, like, well, Marx could never have predicted. Marx failed to realize. It's like the things that Marx talks about at the core are very much still holding. He talks about how in 1914, the real wage had dropped like 11% since 1890, right? How we're seeing the same drop of real wages. I think it was, I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but he says in 2003, I have this in the 2000s was crazy section. Hold on. Real wages averaged 11% less in 2004 than 1973. You know, like we literally have traded off our buying power for cheap goods.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, and part of that is the way that America has tried to economically restructure itself, especially through the 80s. I mean, God, I don't want to talk about the gold standard. But, I mean, it's really telling. There's even that quote on page 296. It's quite late. This is in chapter Democracy for the Few, which is chapter 19 for me. And in the section Democracy as Class Struggle, he says, by the 1970s, it looked like this country might end up as a quasi-egalitarian social democracy unless something was done about it, which, okay, Parenti. As Paul Volcker said when he was chair of the Federal Reserve in 1980, the standard of living of the average American has to decline. I mean, it's that same kind of trade-off. These are decisions imposed upon us from above. NAFTA is a great example. He spends a couple of pages in here talking about the circumstance under which NAFTA was passed, and it was essentially fast-tracked through Congress. Very little debate, very little discussion. It was pushed straight through, despite the fact that it had a huge impact on American workers, you know? It goes back to that same kind of discrepancy I was talking about earlier. He brings up tons of examples about how social spending is always slow-tracked, endless debate. You know, there's all these procedural rules and things, not to mention the fucking filibuster, shit like that prevents these regulations from happening. But then as soon as they want to get something done for the benefit of the ruling class, right, the benefit of the bourgeois, it's done. No problem. Thanks, Bill Clinton. It's just fucking insane.
Yeah.
I mean, oh, God. Not to break so far away from our topic that we're on, but like a damning example is when he talks about the military spending. I mean, something important to know is that the Pentagon has a black budget of $50 billion. And yeah, that's an estimate, but when you're talking about the billions, I don't think it really matters all that much. That's unitemized, right? That's money that we just give straight up to the Pentagon and say, do with it what you will for the purposes of, quote, national security, unquote. And I just need you, the listener, and you, Aaron, to just take a second and realize how much a billion is, okay? And here's a great way to think about it. If you woke up tomorrow and started spending $1 million a day, okay, and you did that for 60 years, you could spend $1 million a day for the rest of your life. You would only have spent half as much as the Pentagon is given yearly to spend at their discretion, okay? It is an insane amount of money that we spend on war. It is an insane amount of money we spend on shit that we develop and then throw away. I've talked about numerous insane examples, right? The fucking Davy Crockett launcher if you want to nuke the next town over. The helicopter with jet engines on the propellers. I mean, we throw money away for nothing. A great quote is when he quotes a Republican senator saying you can't fix the education system by throwing money at it. And then he says, we don't seem to have the same opinion about war. We throw as much money as we can at it all day, every day. Okay, here's another crazy fact. If the Pentagon's missing funds were returned to state and local government, I'm not talking about the black budget. This is just funds that they misplace. Clerical errors in the Pentagon. If the Pentagon's missing funds were returned to state and local governments on a pro rata basis, they all would be able to pay off their debts, vastly improve their educational and health services, provide housing for the homeless, and still have funds left over for other things, all just on what the military misplaces. Another crazy one. To put the military spending in perspective, consider the following. The $800 million Congress saved in 1997 by cutting supplementary security income for 150,000 disabled children amounts to less than 1/3 the cost of building and maintaining one B-2 bomber. The $5.5 trillion spent just for nuclear weapons over the last half century exceed the combined federal spending on education, social services, job programs, the environment, general sciences, energy production, law enforcement, and community and regional development during that same period. That is damning. Okay? We have spent more money on death than we could dream of spending on life.
Yeah. In this section, I don't know how much of it seems like a lot of this is different across our two editions here, but in this section, the thing that really stood out to me is the cost plus contracts. Did you see that?
No.
Okay, so he explains in this section, military contractors generally enjoy what are called cost plus contracts. They get paid whatever it costs to do the job plus a guaranteed profit, and there are no penalties for failure. Hence, the more wasteful the performance, the costlier is the job and the bigger the profit. There is a disincentive to get the job done efficiently and economically when waste is built into the system. And that's fucking crazy to think about someone putting in a bid. If you are a working person and have ever had to like put in bids to get a job, I'm sure sounds absolutely absurd to
Yeah.
you. But you put in a bid for what it's going to cost, plus a built-in guaranteed profit, and you don't have any sort of check to make sure that you are actually going to be successful in the endeavor that you're pursuing, or that the thing that you're producing is going to be successful. So obviously the most beneficial thing in terms of like bringing money into a corporation is to overspend on the production, still get your guaranteed profit built on top of that, and then build it poorly so it does fail, so you can get another bid to do the exact same thing over and over again into perpetuity. He mentions a couple of examples here to talk about spaces where fraud has been committed effectively from defense contractors. Many top defense contractors have been under criminal investigation, but most fraud goes unpunished. The public purse is pilfered on small items too. The military paid $511 for light bulbs that cost 90 cents and $640 for toilet seats that cost $12. And after paying the Boeing company $5,096 for 2 pliers, the tough Pentagon procurers renegotiated the price down to $1,496, a real bargain.
You know, especially, this is what I was talking about when I was saying the Bushes are so blatantly evil, man. All of the fucking defense contracts that we gave to Halliburton during the Iraq War, hey guy, guess who was a huge part of that company? It was our fucking vice president, Dick Cheney.
Dick Cheney, yeah.
You know, absolutely insane. Just to go back to what Parenti was saying about like no cabal, the way he says it is, I really appreciate, is the fact that when these companies go up head to head, what you find so much more often than competition is log rolling.
Collusion.
Yeah, exactly. You know, they work together to make it happen, and it's because they built the system up to then be wrung dry by themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, they make the rules for them to exploit. They draw in the loopholes that they can then go through. It's fucking crazy, man.
Yeah. Another thing from this section that stood out to me, military spending is much preferred by the business community to other forms of government expenditure. Public monies invested in occupational safety, environmental protection, drug rehabilitation, or public schools provide for human needs and create jobs and buying power. But such programs expand the nonprofit public sector, bringing no direct returns to business. If anything, shifting demand away from the private market. In contrast, a weapons contract injects huge amounts of public funds directly into the private corporate sector at a rate of profit that is generally 2 or 3 times higher than what other investments yield. So, money going into military spending is money not being spent on regulating the private sector through funding, regulatory elements of the government. And it takes money that would otherwise be spent on social services or even granted to 501c3s that can then be funneled into big private sector contracts. Win-win for scumbags, I guess.
I mean, what really fucks me up about all of this too is that like all of those guns go somewhere. Like we don't just warehouse all the stuff we develop. A lot of times we just sell it off, right? Or we send it to our own police. I mean, that's really the craziest thing about all of this is that, I mean, it's like the imperial boomerang again. We're seeing all this shit coming right back onto our streets. It's literally the stuff that our taxpayers are having to spend their dollars on. Straight up military equipment, APCs. Your fucking police department doesn't need a tank for any reason.
Yeah, and I would point out one other thing. Being in Ohio, so close to a very prominent Air Force base, one of the things that you hear all the time is like all of the jobs that are created by this sort of military spending. Well, Parenti says otherwise. In any case, civilian spending generates more jobs than military spending. Jobs created by spending $1 billion on the military, 8,555. Jobs created by spending $1 billion on healthcare, 10,779. $1 billion on education, 17,687. $1 billion on mass transit, $19,795. If you want to create jobs, give us a fucking high-speed rail.
Yeah. My God. Yeah, I mean, not to mention, too, that, like, the military is just wholly destructive. I mean, he talks about times where the military Corps of Engineers just absolutely demolishes the environment, so they could build a pipeline or a highway or, a telecom network or something through that. It's interesting, too, because the important thing to remember is that so much of that stuff is contracted out. Parenti has an interesting section where he talks about bureaucracy, and he makes a very compelling case that government bureaucracy is simply more efficient than private bureaucracy. I don't know if that's the same in your edition, but it's so interesting because, like, you'd think that the government would handle its shit more properly when it comes to the military, but I don't know, you kind of have to square that with the fact that we are on a permanent war economy. This is the kind of like military-industrial complex that is keeping our society running, and we just export all of this power to the rest of the world to keep them under our thumb.
Yeah. Here's kind of a shift, but maybe something I should have brought up earlier. Something that I was thinking about while reading this, being alive and politically active at the time that he wrote this, and then reading it now, 17 years later, 16, 17 years later, and seeing the shift in political discourse and political reality in the United States in that time has been really interesting.
Yeah.
And one example that kind of brought that to the fore to me was the section where he's talking about political prisoners.
Yeah.
Which, kudos to him. I think he does a really good job of laying out the stories of a lot of prominent and not as prominent political prisoners of the time and political repression that was happening at the time. I love how focused he is on Black Panther Party through a lot of that section. Shout out to him for that. But it got me thinking a lot about the shift in our political discourse, because I feel like that repression happens so much more openly today. We've been so successfully pacified by the spectacle that it's not even a concern for the average person that political prisoners exist.
Sure.
Back in my younger years, when I was first becoming politically active, that was like one of the things that would get brought up when you're talking about radical politics, was like, people were always talking about Mumia back then.
Yeah.
And he goes through the whole section. He talks about Geronimo Pratt, Fred Hampton. He talks about Mumia and Leonard Peltier. Those were all names that I knew back in those days. But he goes through a handful of other figures. And I don't know, man. I think like the way he writes about it is like it's supposed to be a revelatory thing.
Yeah.
But I think that's just like accepted par for the course now. Like people are getting gunned down in the streets. People are being detained. People are being taken away.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, that's just the reality.
I mean, I have some feelings as to why, and I think it largely has to do with the fact that our political prisoner mostly shifted to terrorists, quote unquote. I mean, it mostly shifted to the war on terror, right? We were able to draw the connection of people that were considered political prisoners to people that were suspected of terrorism. I'm thinking about Guantanamo Bay detainees, even though, 1 second of examination shows you how ridiculous those things are. And so when we think about people being arrested for political reasons today, I don't think that the public has the same kind of picture in their imagination, because when they think of political prisoners, a lot of times, I mean, even Parenti mentions in that section, in 2005, a federal court convicted Muslim spiritual leader Ali Tamimi for remarking to his followers that they should go abroad and train for jihad. I mean, that's the kind of message that I think people would be willing to say, oh, I don't know, maybe we should lock that guy up, because it's the way that we've restructured what we think of as a political prisoner based around the war on terror. Yeah, I think that we've disconnected it from it. We've otherized it. I mean, we've made it into something so disconnected from our populace that we obviously don't think of ourselves as political prisoners. Even though when you think about all the people detained by ICE, those are political prisoners at the end of the day.
100%.
Yeah,
That was exactly what I had in mind.
yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I think it also just has to do with the kind of, I mean, like you said, it's the spectacle of it. Those people, the people that like have led the real revolutionary charge that have been locked up for it, were able to get into the public eye in a different way in the past, where today they're much more minimized. And I think that we've seen the media structures do that in a very pointed way in certain cases that we probably haven't noticed in other ones, like the way that the media treats mass shooters recently, how they've really tried to minimize their identity as being brought out, especially post-Columbine, because they were afraid of copycats. I'm sure that they've held the same standards for revolutionaries, for people that we would consider political prisoners at the time. And so I think it's part of that kind of hegemonic control even. When I see people do direct action online, and then I'll see people talk about them, they'll use like old traditions, like the Elbit 5 or whatever, like that kind of thing. And it's like, we're just not living in the same kind of media landscape where that message has the same impact. You know what I mean? And it's not that those efforts aren't worth it. It's just that it's just a different circumstance now, is what I feel like.
One thing that I was thinking about, I haven't been in a real band it was like 2009, 2010, last time I was in a real band.
Yeah.
And I'm in one now, and we're getting ready to play our first show. And I was thinking about back in the day, and with my old band, one thing that I really liked to do was to distribute agitprop at shows. We didn't have a merch table per se. We had our CDRs that we would give away for donations, so they were free, or you could give us money if you wanted to. We had shirts, sweatshop free shirts that cost us $4.50 to print, and I insisted we shouldn't charge more than $5 for it. It was just such a silly endeavor, but like I loved traveling around collecting agitprop and then copying it and distroing zines and stuff at our merch table. And at the time, I thought of that as a truly revolutionary action, like, because that shit was hard to come by. That shit was hard to come by. The one that really stood out to me back in that day was a zine that was made by Crime Think that had lockpicking stuff in it.
Yeah, totally.
And I just thought that sort of shit was badass, and I loved sharing that. And then when we're talking today, you know, flash forward over 15 years later, and I'm like, it might be cool to put agitprop at the table. And I'm like, but why though? Like, all of this information is on the internet now.
Yeah.
And not that that is still an underground channel to distribute it.
Yeah.
But I don't know, just the landscape is so different now.
Sure.
And I don't know, I'm having weird feelings and thoughts wrapped up around that.
No, I think part of it is that I think that maybe what you're feeling might be the fact that, in a sense, we've had more ability to distribute than ever, you know, because like the modern agitprop is on the internet. It's on TikTok, not just TikTok. I don't want to give it too much credit, but it's like the sense that we have it so much more ability to distribute. We're so much more interconnected on so much of a wider space, but at the same time, we still understand how severely limited we are by those things. You know, like we might have short form video platforms to distribute, but we're hampered by the algorithm, right? Yeah. And I think so much of that you see in like the discussion around TikTok after it finally got bought by an American company or whatever, you know, it got forcibly sold. And so I think that, you know, what we're feeling is like it's a bit of a disparity between just like the amount of reach we feel we should have and the amount of reach that actually happens, you know? Because I think that that's like a big difference in distributing agitprop at your show, say, is that you control directly the reach, you know? The people that you are reaching, you see. When it comes to the internet, you just kind of throw it out there. You know, you scream it out into the void and then pray that the fucking algorithm does its job, or the word of mouth, quote unquote, of the internet works.
I was thinking of the algorithm when you mentioned like TikTok or whatever, and that as a limiting factor.
Yeah.
But
just to back up that thing, like I've seen a lot of zines like that on Internet Archive, you know, like you can still go and see that stuff. You just kind of have to seek it out, right? It is so much more available than ever before. It's just that like it's in the midst of all of this other stuff.
Like part of it is that distributing that stuff at a show, your audience is captive. People are there because they're interested in something like-minded. Yeah. And so you're sharing that stuff to the right people. Getting 1,500 impressions, which is just fucking shoot me, is different because how many of those 1,500 people actually give a shit about it? Yeah. Truly. The other downside to the internet as a sense of like distributing stuff like that is bombardment. I think like agitprop was impactful to me in those days, and even younger when I was first starting to go to shows and I first started encountering that stuff. We were playing, when I first started going on the road to play shows, which wasn't a lot. I wasn't like a touring guy or anything. Sure. I don't want to make it sound cooler than it was. But when we did go out on the road, it was almost always set up in collective cooperative spaces. And so there was always mostly anarchist agitprop stuff there. And the folks were always super keen on like talking to you about that and sharing all that sort of shit. And it was like there was an intensely profound impact that those things had. Like Crime Think had a huge impact on me back then. Yeah. Largely because I found some zines and then I started buying their books, and you know, became a big deal to me. But now with bombardment, it's almost, and I feel the same way about like the shit with Gaza, man. I mean, I think people are so overrun with the images that it's like there's a desensitizing factor there that like changes your reaction to it. And I think that that's largely true of our reaction to the internet in general.
Gosh, I mean, it's almost like fatigue. And I hate saying that because it sucks, you know, but like TikTok is so terrible about that shit too. You know, if I see one of those Gaza fundraiser videos, that if I watch it, then suddenly I'm getting hundreds of them, you know, and that really is, it's horrible because I can't give to every one of them, you know, I just have to scroll past sometimes, and that really sucks. I think that part of it is kind of that similar thing where like these things are far enough in the past, quote unquote, that we can talk about them openly. What the internet has done is given us such a space of such bombardment that it shortens the amount of time for that stuff to matter. You know, like, I mean, Gaza's a great example, man. Right now, the last big media thing about Gaza was a ceasefire. And if you've been paying any attention, you know that it's a total fucking farce, right? Israel kills 40, 50 Palestinians every single day. They're invading other countries nearby them. They're doing airstrikes in Syria, all sorts of shit. The media landscape has said, this is far enough in the past that we can disregard it, you know? And it's that same kind of thing, like, you know, it is being served to so many people, but it's just one impression in a sea of hundreds of thousands, you know? And even from the other side, from the viewer side, it's one video you see in a sea of hundreds of thousands. It's really nefarious. I mean, it's like demonic. It's the fucking Antichrist, man. That's what it is. It's just crazy. That kind of fatigue, I think, is part of the feeling that I feel about this book. I was just like reading over and over all of these different statistics. It's like, yeah, America sucks shit.
Yeah.
Great. You know what this book should be is like your fucking bathroom reader. Like, did you ever have those Uncle John's like bathroom books?
No.
Oh my God. They're like fat fact books that you put on your toilet. So when you take a shit, you can thumb through it for a couple of, it's like, that's what this is.
Yeah.
You know, open it up and read about how Clinton emerged as the presidential candidate in 1991, talking to Wall Street executives in an elegant cattle show, you know, stuff like that. It's like you open it up and read a fun fact. If you read it cover to cover, you're going to be fucking fatigued.
That's it right there. Why I am unsatisfied with this book, because it's all analysis, it's no praxis. Like, now what is okay, you know what I mean, is the question that I keep asking myself. And I know that the last chapter is his what is to be done, which I know that he did on purpose.
It's hemmed in, though. That's the thing, is that I think that it's tempered. He does say, even, and I don't know how different it is in your section, but he does say that, like, just even if we make all of these political changes, because he gives a list of different things we could change right now in America, you know, he's like, what really matters is a change in our system of production. You know, who owns the means? That's what really matters. I mean, he says straight up, like, what we need is a form of socialism. That's really it.
Yeah.
And I think that it's such like a little touch at the end that it doesn't carry the same kind of weight that I would expect, especially after reading 200 and something pages of damning statistics. Like,
yeah, I think what would have maybe helped with that fatigue would be to end each chapter with, rather than putting it all at the end of chapter 19, end each chapter with a response to like all of that stuff. But it is really fatiguing to sit and just read stat after stat after stat, fact after fact after fact. Because, I agree with the first one. I'm like, yeah, that sucks. I don't need any more. And then it goes on for 30 more pages.
Yeah.
And so it is, I had a hard time getting through the book, largely because it's like not difficult to read. Like, it's a breezy read prose wise, you know, but it's just hard. I'm like, what? Why am I doing this?
Yeah. Now, I was going to say, though, because, like, hold on, because we've read a book just like this recently, and it's Socialist Reconstruction. Yeah.
I kept thinking about that while reading this.
Yeah. And the thing is that I didn't care for that either,
Really?
where it just said, oh, okay, here's all these problems, and now we'll do the People's
Ministry
Department.
of-
Yeah, exactly. You know, and so, I don't know. I mean, like, maybe the premise of this book and that book is just kind of flawed in that sense, because I'm thinking about what Parenti says, because they say the same thing in Socialist Reconstruction, where it's unfair to say you can't diagnose the illness before perfecting the cure, you know? And it's just the problem that, like, the illness has been diagnosed. The illness was diagnosed fucking 100 years ago at this point. I don't know if this book needed to exist. You know what I mean? Like, it's only in the context of the fucking wool over their eyes Americans that were present in 08, 010, whatever. 010, Jesus Christ. You know, I mean, and before, don't forget that the first edition of this book was published in 1974.
Yeah.
So Parenti's been doing this for a while, and I'm sure that part of the issues we might have with the structure come from the fact that it's been updated 9 full times.
Yeah.
So I would really love to know how much of this book was present in the first edition.
Yeah. And how much of it has been tempered? Because even some of the quotes that you've read, some of the language is different in mine. I'm following along with the text and seeing it, it's like slightly tweaked. And I wonder how much of that criticism that we're having, that he's tempering his rhetoric there, it comes from all of the iterations with the publishers. Like,
Parenti is incredibly progressive in an 08 lens, especially. I mean, he talks about the plight of homosexuals in this book, you know, but that's exactly the thing. The plight of homosexuals. What an 08 thing there. No, it's even older than that is the problem. Parenti is an old man. Parenti's an old man.
He uses the word skullduggery.
Skullduggery. Well, there's a chapter where he's talking about the plight of the youth, and he can't stop saying youngsters. Like, my God. Yeah, don't forget that he was almost 100 when he died, man.
Yeah.
Like, he was born in 33, I think. So, you know, he is incredibly progressive. I really bet I would have some interesting feelings reading the older editions.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, it's even present in some of his lectures. You know, I've listened to some of his lectures from the late 80s, in the mid 90s, even the 2000s, where he talks about some stuff, and I'm just like, wow, man, is that really the language you wanted to use there?
Yeah.
He's a classic old white guy. I'll say that much.
I have a handful of random quotes I'd like to jump in. I mean, I guess we could just do them in the cavalcade.
Yeah, Yeah, I don't
also marked all of the quotes that I think are unique to this.
Yeah, what in your edition was new in your eyes? What did you think was like, oh, what does he feel like? What does he feel about Obama?
Well, I'll go to a quote specifically in response to that. I think my reading of this is that I think he is far too kind to Obama.
Yeah. He's very kind to every Democratic president. And not that he's not critical of Clinton and even Carter, but like so much of it is focused at Republicans. I mean, that much is easy to tell why, because it's very easy to pick many examples from how Republicans and conservatives are not working in everyone's interests.
Okay, well, so this example of Obama, this is in the last environment chapter, and it's right after he talks about George Bush, so it seems clear that he's just, with each edition, going in and adding a little bit. But he says, beset by a profound economic crisis into the second year of his administration, President Barack Obama was unwilling or unable to pursue any kind of ecological master plan that could bring a dramatic reversal. The American Clean Energy and Security Act of 2009 aims at reducing greenhouse emissions 17% by 2020. Other provisions include new renewable requirements for utilities, new energy efficiency incentives for homes and buildings, and grants for green jobs, all steps in the right direction, but relatively small steps. This wasn't the first time I had clocked one of these Obama quotes here where he's just being way too kind.
Yeah.
It's just too close to apologia to me. And there's a lot of it. Every mention of Obama is framed through these rose-colored glasses. And I guess this is before it became widespread and well known that Obama was deporting more people than anyone else, that he was drone striking brown people left and right. Maybe this is before all of that happened. You know, the WikiLeaks stuff and Snowden's stuff came in like 2014. Like it was after that, I guess. But I don't know. It's just every time I saw Obama, I was just like, here we go.
Yeah. Something that's so tough for me is that like there's a real tendency to give Democrats the benefit of the doubt, like saying they were trying their best given the worst circumstances. Like even right now in Reagan land, you know, I'm reading about Jimmy Carter, who comes in with all these great intentions, and then he's like hamstrung by the circumstances around him, you know? And I wonder how much of that is the same with Obama. Like how progressive was Obama really going into it when at the end of the day, he comes out ultimately very cynically in my mind. I mean, everything that he's done post-presidency has just been catered around his own image. And it's really rough to see, especially because he was someone that everyone gave their credence to so easily, you know?
He came out the gate a centrist. Like any idea of him being progressive was non-existent in the circles that I saw. Like that's not to say that the people that I knew and I did not vote for him.
Sure.
You know what I mean? But like there was no promise of progressive politic coming from Obama. It was a reach across the aisle kind of centrism bullshit.
That's fair. Just a vibe of change, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, just a slogan, like literally.
Exactly.
Man.
There is some stuff about the housing crisis and the bank bailouts and stuff. It's just numbers. I mean,
just statistics. I mean, that's fair. I will say that he does predict '08 a little bit in the chapters here. I don't know. It's interesting to think about both the Great Depression and the Great Recession as that same kind of crisis of overproduction. I think that's interesting because that's been a question that's been on my mind for a while is like what caused the '08 recession. The answer I got in school was never very satisfying. And then if you look online, people say it's like over speculation. You know, I know The Big Short. I mean, I know that whole shebang. Mm-hmm. Like I know the details of the subprime mortgage crisis or whatever. Yeah. But to contextualize it in that kind of Marxist framework of overproduction, I think is pretty interesting. And it's not one that I had seen before, at least. So I appreciated that. Okay, well, did you want to just cavalcade it out here?
Yeah, fuck it. Let's jump into the cavalcade. There were a number of 2026 hold my beer moments in this because he throws out numbers as though they're supposed to be alarmingly large.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, come on, you don't even know what world you're living in. I'll throw a couple of those out real quick. So sorry, I'm going to be jumping out of order here, but he's talking about, this is in chapter 12, Who Governs Elites, Labor and Globalization in the Ruling Class section. He's talking about the growing class divide that is occurring. And he says that the collective corporate stock ownership by Bohemian Grove members and guests conservatively exceeds 100 billion. Come on. That's not one person now. And then there's another very similar one earlier in the book. This is in chapter 5, Institutions and Ideologies. So he's talking about This is the section Corporate Rule and Ruin, Some Examples, and he goes through a list of modern giant corporations. He mentions Walmart, Cargill, ExxonMobil. And so in 2008, ExxonMobil reported the largest annual profit in U.S. history, $45 billion. So I was like, I want to look that up. So I looked at, had that record been broken by another U.S. corporation? The answer is yes, that record has been broken 19 times since 2008.
Wow.
The record right now is held by Apple in 2022. Their annual profits were $99.8 billion. They broke the previous record held by Apple in 2021 of $94.6 billion. That ExxonMobil record is like 10 down the list.
Jesus Christ, man.
And there were a bunch of times where stuff like that showed up, and I was like, I wonder what this is in 2026. I didn't look all of them up, but I did look that one up.
Yeah, I did follow up on a couple of things. Like, there's a part where he talks about the Tyco executives. They get sentenced from 8 to 25 years. And, you know, he was like, we'll see how much they actually serve. The answer is they served the minimum amount. Both of them served 8 years. So, you know, just that kind of disparity again.
Yeah, there's a lot in that criminal justice section where he's talking about prison sentences and kind of asymmetrical justice that's happening there. But just examples of people getting bare minimum sentences for egregious crimes, corporate crimes.
Yeah.
And then, like you referenced earlier, someone getting a life sentence for stealing 100.
Yeah, just fucking ridiculous stuff. Although I will say there was one that was very funny that was like, a guy got 50 years for a possession of a few ounces of marijuana. It's like, man, a few ounces of marijuana? Come on. You know, not that that's worth 55 years in jail or any punishment for the record, but a few ounces, man, that guy was carrying. Jeez. Quarter pound, huh? Anyway, yeah, I do like, he does so many examples that we didn't really get a chance to touch on. Like, a couple that I really appreciated were in his chapter on the mass media. I know that Parenti has an entire book on, you know, inventing reality.
Dude, I've been wanting, that's the book I want to read.
Yeah.
It's fucking impossible to get a copy for a reasonable price.
Yeah, I bet, especially now, gosh. Although I will say that I've seen now a couple of places that have archived all of his stuff in one place. So we can get it if we need to.
You can get it online.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I did love a couple of these. You know, he talks about the Dixie Chicks being canceled, Michael Moore. He mentions the Sinclair Group, which has only become more of a monopolistic threat to. It's that thing that's like, this is extremely dangerous for our democracy, and it's 2,000 news channels all saying the same thing.
Yeah.
And I really love on 177, he talks about John Stossel emerging as a laissez-faire ideologue. I watched Stossel in the classroom, and you know, I remember a lot of those. Like, there was one where he talks about panhandlers, how they can make more just panhandling than getting a real job, shit like that. It's like, man, this was taught to me, you know, like this
part of your indoctrination.
It's fucking crazy.
Yeah.
That's insane. If you've never seen those kinds of examples, I mean, this book is chock full of them. Even, we didn't largely talk about any of the U.S. imperialism abroad, but mostly because we've talked about it before, but he talks about a lot of them, even a few I had never seen before, like in the 80s, the Vosern attacks. This is in Political Murder USA in the chapter Political Repression and National Insecurity. In the United States, between 1981 and 1987, there were 11 killings of Vietnamese publishers, journalists, and activists who had advocated relations with the communist government of Vietnam. In each instance, a U.S.-backed right-wing Vietnamese organization, Vosern, V-O-E-C-R-N, claimed responsibility. One of Vosern's victims, a publisher of a Vietnamese-language weekly, survived a shooting and identified the gunman. The assailant was convicted, but the conviction was reversed at the prosecutor's request because, quote, he had no prior criminal record in this country. The police and FBI claimed that such attacks were unrelated, despite Vosern's communiques claiming responsibility. You know, and that's nothing new. I mean, our government's involvement with Cuban exiles in Miami, they're basically just a block of the conservative party now. They're just completely intertwined with our government at this point, you know? It's just insane the way that they do those kinds of things. And if you've never seen any of those examples, I mean, this book is fucking full of them. Yeah. Oh, also, just want to mention on the very next page, the 1979 Greensboro Massacre, which I've talked about before. He brings it up here and says exactly what happens. The FBI had infiltrated both parties, except they provided the KKK with guns. They knew exactly what was going to happen during the march, and they still allowed it to happen. And as a result, I think 3 people died, and a couple were wounded. But they were just communists, so, you know, who cares?
Early on in chapter 3, there's this bit about FDR, and I appreciated Parenti pointing out FDR's true legacy here. The disparity between the New Deal's popular image and its actual accomplishments remains one of the unappreciated aspects of the Roosevelt era. For instance, the Civilian Conservation Corps provided jobs at subsistence wages for only 3 million of the 15 million unemployed. At its peak, the Works Progress Administration and related agencies employed almost 9 million people, but often for unstable duration and grossly inadequate wages. The Social Security Act of 1935 covered but half the population and provided paltry monthly payments with no medical insurance or protection against illness before retirement. I think this is another one of those examples of rewriting history in hindsight that try to paint FDR as some sort of socialist figure when he was not only a rabid anti-communist, but also the programs that he was putting out here were not in any way providing everything that people needed.
Right. And, Parenti does talk about, all of the good things done by the New Deal at the end of the day. But the purpose of the New Deal is to create a new deal between labor and capital. I mean, he literally saved capitalism in the United States. Yeah. And, I may have overstated in the past the kind of revolutionary potential that might have existed in the 30s in the U.S. Revolution in the U.S. is a complex beast regardless. But there's no denying the fact that the system that the U.S. existed in the 20s was clearly untenable and had to be saved. And, Roosevelt came in to do that. We laud him as this huge progressive because if we think of all these, what it reminds me of is when he's talking about the founders, the way that the founders make their concessions. I mean, this is the New Deal in a nutshell for me. It says it here. I'm in the chapter, A Constitution for the Few. The delegates gave nothing to popular interest, rather, as with the Bill of Rights. They reluctantly made democratic concessions under the threat of popular rebellion. They kept what they could and grudgingly relinquished what they felt they had to, driven not by a love of democracy, but by a fear of it. Not by a love of the people, but a prudent desire to avoid riot and insurgency. And it's the same kind of thing. Like, we can talk all day about the way that the New Deal changed American society and provided some good programs for people. I mean, whatever, all those New Deal programs. But the point is, at the end of the day, that was fucking capitalism's saving grace. Not to say that we would have had some beautiful American socialist democracy or whatever. It's just as likely that we would have had super American fascism instead of regular American fascism. But that's really it, man.
Yeah. Okay, I got 4 quotes to go on a vegan run here, so let me do that.
Hit me.
I'm going to be jumping all over. Quote number 1, contrary to popular belief, large commercial agribusiness farms do not produce more efficiently than small farms. Agribusiness mass production techniques damage topsoil, cause enormous waste runoffs, and produce heavily chemicalized crops and livestock. An estimated 70% of the antibiotics used in this country are fed to factory farm animals as a regular feed supplement to increase their weight. And because the animals are crowded by the thousands in inhumane and unhealthy quarters, the medications are used to lessen the chance of infection. But the buildup of antibiotics in the food chain is putting both humans and animals increasingly at risk as drug-resistant diseases quickly develop. And he goes on to talk a little bit about slaughter there, in which he says family farms treat their animals in a healthier and more humane way, injecting less antibiotics and hormones in livestock. I'll just close that quote by saying there's no humane slaughter. Doesn't matter how fucking nice you are to them before you slit their throat. Quote number 2. When Monsanto, owned by DuPont, introduced bovine growth hormone, BGH, to induce dairy cows to produce abnormally high amounts of milk, the FDA approved the biotech Wonder Drug, even though consumer groups questioned its unknown effects on children and adults. Cows injected with BGH suffer from illness and malnutrition, making it necessary to augment their already high intake of antibiotics. The federal government already buys surplus milk supplies. The increase in BGH milk production will cost taxpayers additional millions, mostly benefiting a few giant dairy producers. Go vegan for the animals, but also this is true. Next, according to one report, meat consumption is the most environmentally harmful activity consumers can engage in, except for operating a gas-driven car.
Ew.
True, not the point, but still go vegan. And then lastly, this is from the U.S. Global Military Empire section. The Department of Defense is one of the biggest and cruelest users of animal experimentation. Animals are burned, shot, bled, irradiated, dosed with biological, nuclear, and chemical weapons, assaulted with cannonades, assaulted with cannonades of noise, exposed to deadly viruses, and then studied as they suffer lingering deaths. Obvious example of animal abuse, an obvious example of the commodification of animals and the depersonification of animals that sees them as morally insignificant. Go vegan.
I only have a couple of gripes to Parenti's that I want to air, and I will also give him some appreciation. I will say that I really did appreciate the chapter about the Supreme Court. I think that one is really well laid out, tons of examples, really just shows how entrenched a conservative, the fact that the Supreme Court is a conservative institution, it does a really good job of that. Shout outs. I will say that something really funny I thought on chapter 3, this is the plutocratic culture, institutions, and ideologies, where he's talking about kind of the redeemability of Americans. He does address the fact that most Americans probably have insane politics. I will say, he's kind of in the middle, right? He says that they're progressive on a lot of things and they're reactionary in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. And he says something interesting here on page 36. This is not to deny that there remain millions of Americans, including many of relatively modest means, who succumb to the culture of fear propagated by right-wing reactionaries. Yet, this society does not produce large numbers of conservative activists. There are no mass demonstrations demanding tax cuts for the rich, more environmental devastation, more wars, and more corporate accumulation of wealth. And all I can say there is, man, that's wrong. Not only after Parenti wrote that, but also before. The entire Reagan reaction is essentially that in a nutshell. Maybe he's trying to give a hand to America as a whole there, but it's just kind of, he misses the beat, in my opinion.
Yeah. Agreed.
And I just have to say, okay, on 86...
Is this a Yugoslavia
It
thing?
absolutely is. Okay, it absolutely is. Also targeted was Yugoslavia, a fairly large and prosperous country that still retained many socialist features. Notice that he doesn't say it's a socialist country, which I've mentioned before, how if you read Michael Parenti or hear Michael Parenti through the years, you can see his goalposts change, and I think that this is an example of that. He says, a series of Western financed secessionist wars helped break Yugoslavia into a cluster of privatized right-wing free market republics. Partially true, at least, okay? You can talk about Slovene and Croatian independence. I don't necessarily want to. But then he says, Yugoslav leaders were charged with, quote, genocide and, quote, ethnic cleansing by President Clinton and his associates and subjected in 1999 to 78 days of bombing by U.S.-led NATO forces that killed or wounded thousands and devastated the infrastructure, and ecology of that once prosperous nation. Okay, I don't know what I'm trying to say here, besides the fact that, what the fuck are you doing, Michael Parenti? I really hate the fact that you undermine your own credibility with this kind of stuff, because I understand exactly what you're trying to say here, but in the very next paragraph you say, the main victims of ethnic cleansing seem to be the Serbs themselves, as large numbers of them were driven from their ancestral homes in Croatia, Bosnia, and Kosovo, along with many thousands of Roma, Guarani, and Jews. Hey man, you don't need to do that. Okay, I just have to put it out there that that's fucking gross. All right, I've simply read too many reports about specifically the Bosnian War on its own to think that the Serbs are oppressed in any capacity.
Yeah,
sorry, guy. And if you're a Serbian and listening, you're not damned for being a Serbian. That's not what I'm saying. But that's not a line I'm going to follow, Michael Parenti. I'll tell you that much.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, those were the gripes I had. Oh, actually, one more. I thought it was very funny on page 98 when he says that there is a model of healthcare already in the U.S. worth looking at, and it's the Veterans Health Administration. Wow. Was it better in 2008, really? I don't know if that was the case.
Doubt it.
Yeah.
I doubt it.
I mean, and it's only gotten worse. That's the thing. It's like that statement truly doesn't stand up. I don't know if he makes the same claim in your edition.
He does talk about the Veterans Health Administration, but at the end, he does basically advocate for Medicare for all.
Yeah. Totally. I mean, yeah. The single payer model, that's a mood.
Yeah. I'll close with something on a more positive note. This comes from the final chapter, and it was one of those rare moments where I had a feeling of revolutionary optimism, because Parenti writes, there is a tradition of popular struggle in the United States that has been downplayed and ignored. It ebbs and flows, but never ceases. Moved by a combination of anger and hope, ordinary people have organized, agitated, demonstrated, and engaged in electoral challenges, civil disobedience, strikes, sit-ins, takeovers, boycotts, and sometimes violent clashes with the authorities for socioeconomic betterment at home and peace abroad. Against the heaviest odds, dissenters have suffered many defeats, but won some important victories, forcibly extracting concessions and imposing reforms upon resistant rulers. And I felt a little charged when I read that. Shout out.
I mean, that's the American ideal at the end of the day, is that like we are a diverse people that are willing to fight together for the greater good in so many different ways. That's like the positive thing that Michael Parenti keeps saying about America, is that like all of our real social gains have been fought for by the people. And that's beautiful, okay? Yeah. It's not necessarily exclusive to America. It's just something that is beautiful in American history. You know, and that's that. What questions did this book leave you with, Aaron?
The one question that I had, I already kind of presented, and I ask it rhetorically, even though I kind of have a position on it already, but it is this question about the approach for gaining broad appeal. Is it right to start soft, to soften our rhetoric, to try to ease people into a leftist politic?
Yeah.
Because everyone's so afraid of the word communist, you know what I mean? Like, is that a tactic that should be taken? I have nothing to back this up other than my own impression, but I feel a little bit like that's what this book was intended to do. And I could see it potentially having some merit. But the question is that an approach? Is that a valid tactic?
Yeah, my question is the same. It's just worded in a much harsher way, and it's what are the merits of sloppyism? You know, what are the merits of left slop? Is this a book worth reading? I mean, that's the thing. It's not for us, but does this recontextualize Parenti for me? That's a question I can't answer right now. Not really any other questions. I already knew America sucked shit. I didn't need to read a book for that.
Yeah, same. That's a good example. And that leads to my first, you should read this if. You should read this if you are looking for a broad survey of the evils of imperialism.
Yeah.
Because that's what it is.
Yeah.
Very broad.
You know, you should read this if, you know, I think an interesting case for reading this is something like this, where I got a really interesting glimpse of the fucking Bush era right in here. I know yours was not necessarily as satisfying, but I am kind of interested in seeing that 1980s edition. You know, I don't know if I want to read it, but like, I'm curious to see the evolution of this, you know, and that's something I've expressed before about Parenti. Like, it's fun to follow up on his sources, even if you're just fact checking him, because you get to read so many other things. You get to, I mean, he's an eccentric guy. I'll say that much.
It's funny you say that, because the other one that I had written here was, you should read this if you want to check the pulse of broad leftism in 2009.
Yeah, man.
But like, that was the era for me. I was reading Chomsky. I was really taken by Greg Palast at the time, reading his first book about the election in 2000 being stolen, and then his other book, Armed Madhouse. I really loved that book. Parenti wasn't on my radar back then, but I would have loved this back then,
yeah.
I think.
No, I think that's fair. I think Parenti is right more than he's wrong. You know, I don't even mean that in his messaging. I just think that even if I were to check all of his sources, I feel like I would come up positive more than negative.
Yeah.
And I have done that a couple times. Like, Parenti is a guy where I will follow his sources up because sometimes it's a little sloppy. Oh, just to say, man, you know what really pisses me the fuck off? He will quote, this is not an exclusive for anything, but he'll quote someone and he will not attribute the quote to any specific speaker. And then if you go to the source, it's still not. It's just like New York Times 1985 or whatever. And it's like, I don't know who said this. Yeah. Where are you getting this from? That pisses me off. So, undemerit, Michael Parenti.
Especially following this up from Caliban and the Witch, which was such a rigidly sourced and perfectly sourced book. To see this in juxtaposition with that is a little bit like, revealing, I guess.
Yeah.
Also, don't forget to send any thoughts, questions, concerns, book recommendations, or whatever to leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
So,
next time,
Soledad Brother.
That's right. We're going to read Soledad Brother by George Jackson. Blood in My Eye is probably my favorite book that we've read so far for the show. So I'm super stoked to read this. Really looking forward to it.
I'm pumped. And don't get left unread.
That's right. Bye-bye.
See ya.